Video 3 for January 31st in the last video. Alright, so we just talked about demobilization, how the soldiers got to come back, find a job. There's a lot of issues, growing pains, or shrinking pains really, after the war, trying to, lay off people and get the factories back to normal, making consumer goods. Another big problem that comes out in all this is the Red Scare. Called the first Red Scare because there'll be a second Red Scare after World War II for basically the same reasons. So the Bolshevik Revolution has a big impact on Americans. The Bolsheviks in Russia, these socialists and communists, helped overthrow the Russian government in 1917, and the fear is that the same thing can happen here. As we know, there are socialists, there are communists in America, like Eugene Debs. There's a socialist party. A lot of working class, a lot of unions are all in that boat. So the worry is that those people might be influenced, especially in this rough year of 1919, that they need to do a revolution, overthrow what's there, the government and so forth. So there's a big fear and a big worry that there could be a big socialist communist takeover. Also, because of the war, there's a big anti-immigrant feeling too. So what you also want to put down is that there's very strong feelings in nativism that developed after the war too. So because of all this patriotic fever, it made us very focused on us and against foreigners. So there's a lot of fear of nativists because we have a lot. There's a lot of fear of immigrants. So there's a resurgence of nativists. Because of all this, essentially, a lot of immigrants begin to start to come back to America after the war. Some of these immigrants come from East Europe, where there were socialists and Bolsheviks and people who believed these radical ideas. And we were worried that these people might be influenced by Russia and bring their ideas here. So the Red Scare is going to be targeting or focusing on socialists and communists, but also a lot of foreigners, a lot of immigrants who might be bringing these radical ideas to us in general. So there's all of a sudden anti-communism hysteria in 1919 that lasts until 1920. It's called the Red Scare because red is the communism color. Look at all their flags and stuff. So that's where the name comes from. Things get intensified whenever there are bombs being mailed out. So there's some anarchists out there mailing bombs to people, blowing up people's homes, injuring people. And then the Attorney General under Wilson, Mitchell Palmer, has a bomb mailed to his house. He's okay whenever it's sent and goes off, but it just causes more hysteria. So Palmer, who's the head of the Justice Department, decides to do an investigation and roundup of suspected communists and socialists, anarchists, and the like. So in 1919, he begins what's referred to as the Palmer Raids, actually appointing future FBI head J. Edgar Hoover to lead this. So J. Edgar Hoover, you don't really need to know that, but J. Edgar Hoover led the investigations to go round up all the radicals. So this is another example of an American witch hunt, essentially. This is another example of an American witch hunt that develops here in 1920. The Palmer Raids, as they'll become called, is where you're going to have the federal government go out and investigate anybody they suspect of being communist. Radicals, socialists, a lot of them are foreigners, a lot of them are immigrants at this point. And so between November of 1919 and then spring of 1920, over 6,000 people are arrested. 6,000 people are arrested. Socialists, anarchists, communists, labor agitators, all those people. 6,000 folks are arrested, many on just basically suspicion of being communists or radicals. No actual proof they're going to do anything radical or terrorist-like, but 6,000 people get arrested in that window of several months. People get thrown in jail. A lot of them are immigrants, and they'll be but this is why we call it a witch hunt, because there's very little proof, or it's all based on suspicion. Some of those immigrants are going to end up going to get deported because of this too. So some immigrants get deported because of these investigations. Some go to jail long term. So by late 1920, though, or mid 1920, Palmer's raids began to lose credibility after they began to realize that they didn't really have good proof as to who they were targeting, and people began to worry about their civil liberties. So the Palmer raids will end, and the Red Scare only lasts about a year and a half. But for a while, we were very worried and paranoid about labor people, communists, radicals, socialists, foreigners, who all we saw might pose a threat to the country. And so 6,000 folks get arrested and go to jail because of those suspicions. All right, labor conflict. So With high values on free enterprise, many Americans distrusted unions again after all this. So all those price controls and labor controls during the war end when the war ends, and a lot of those workers got used to having better pay, and a lot of them joined unions during the war. So you have millions of people who are in unions by the end of the war. You have about 5 million people. 5 million people in America are in unions when World War I ends in 1919. So, but Americans don't necessarily trust unions because they are seen as limitations on free enterprise. The progressive era helped their image, and they did achieve gains during World War I, but the post-war fear revolution that develops with like the Red Scare turned the public against them again, because a lot of those working class types would be very enticed by socialist ideas or communist ideas, and so people begin to suspect them again as being bad for America. What doesn't help is that a lot of these people go on strikes. I don't have a blurb on this, but a lot of people go on strikes. 1919 was a huge year for strikes because wages go down, a lot of their protections go away, they don't have the same kind of overtime or work protections anymore, people lost their jobs. So throughout that year alone, over 2 million Americans go on strike. Not all at the same time, but 2 million Americans go on strike that year, which just makes a lot of people very much worried America could be coming apart at home. So a lot of folks are worried that about 2 million workers go on a strike in that time period. Seattle saw 60,000 unionists join shipyard workers in a peaceful strike. So Seattle saw 60,000 unionists join a shipyard strike. And all this worry is that, you have these massive strikes that could very easily lead to like a revolution. I have a cartoon up here, you can't really tell. It says, it's a series of steps. The guy's foot says labor, and it's like a step down to chaos. You have strikes and walkouts, disorder and riots, Bolshevism and murder, then chaos, and who knows what after that. So the whole idea is that it's a stepping stone towards greater radicalism. Boston had a massive police strike in 1920, and they wanted better pay. They hadn't had a pay raise since before the war. But the governor at the time, Calvin Coolidge, was able to send the National Guard in to help break up the police strike in Boston. Then you have a very large steel strike in September that resulted in troops being used to break that up as well, too. So there was also a steel strike used in September to break that up as well. So lots of strike. Too many people go into on strike that year, and it just makes public opinion turn against them again. And because of that, you go from having 5 million people in unions down to about 3.5 million in the 20s. So by the time you get to the mid-20s, you get down to 3.5 million people in unions. So membership declines in this time period. So you want to have that down. The membership declines in this time period for unions. Last thing, then we'll stop the video, the racial riots. African Americans have migrated during the war. A lot of them were living in northern cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, all these different places. So now you have African Americans who didn't really live up north before, now living up north, competing for the same jobs as whites. And so that racial tension that develops in 1919, 1920 will spill over into riots and to racial violence. Not necessarily in the South, which they already have their ongoing issues, but now you're going to see the North do the same thing. So whites resented this competition for jobs and housing in major cities. Some racial riots erupted during World War I and after World War I. So there's a lot of violent racial riots in 1919 with several different cities. The worst one was in Chicago, where 40 people were killed and 500 injured. So in 1919, 40 people were killed in Chicago and 500 were injured in that city at that time. So racial riots peak in that year because of the competition for housing and jobs. Several cities see them, but Chicago had the worst one by far. So that's the last video, and I'll send the notes via Remind out later on. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday. Don't forget to